The American Civil War was a conflict that tore the nation apart. By late 1864, the tide of the war had turned in favor of the Union.
Union General William Tecumseh Sherman embarked on a bold campaign known as Sherman's March to the Sea. Starting from Atlanta, Sherman led his army of 60,000 men on a scorched earth campaign through the Confederacy.
Sherman's march was more than just a military campaign, it was a statement. Sherman's orders were clear: destroy anything that could support the Confederate war effort.
The Confederacy was desperate to stop Sherman's advance, with General Joseph Wheeler determined to slow him down.
On December 4, 1864, Wheeler's cavalry clashed with Sherman's forces.
Wheeler's objective was to harass and delay the Union advance.
Sherman, however, was a determined and ruthless opponent. He was acutely aware of the importance of his mission and the need to reach Savannah before the Confederacy could regroup.
The stage was set for a clash of wills between two skilled military commanders. The immediate impact of Wheeler halting Sherman's march would have been felt on the battlefield. Sherman's army would have faced a determined and prepared enemy.
Instead of an unimpeded advance, Sherman would have faced fortified positions and a reinvigorated Confederate army.
This turn of events would have been a significant morale boost for the Confederacy. The delay would have given the Confederate High Command time to strategize and potentially launch counteroffensives.
For Savannah, the delay of Sherman's advance would have been a lifeline.
The city's defenses could have been reinforced and expanded.
More importantly, the delay would have allowed for the evacuation of vital supplies and industrial equipment.
The city's civilian population may have been spared the hardships of a prolonged siege. The military impact of Wheeler stopping Sherman would have extended far beyond Georgia.
The delay would have had significant implications for the Union's overall war strategy.
General Ulysses S. Grant had planned for Sherman's march to coincide with his own campaign against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia.
Sherman's success in capturing Savannah was intended to weaken Lee's forces.
With Sherman's advance stalled, Grant would have faced a dilemma.
The delay would have also had a ripple effect on other Union campaigns in the Western Theater.
The ripple effect of Wheeler stopping Sherman would have altered the strategic calculus for both sides. The year 1864 was a pivotal one for the United States.
President Abraham Lincoln, facing a divided electorate weary of war, was locked in a tight race with his Democratic opponent, former General George McClellan.
Lincoln's hopes for re-election rested heavily on the success of his generals in the field.
News of Sherman's triumphs in Georgia had invigorated Lincoln's supporters.
However, a successful effort by Wheeler to halt Sherman's advance would have sent shock waves through the North.
The political consequences for Lincoln would have been dire.
The potential for McClellan's victory in the 1864 election raises the unsettling possibility of a negotiated peace with the Confederacy.
McClellan had shown a willingness to seek a negotiated settlement with the Confederacy.
A McClellan presidency would have likely resulted in the opening of peace negotiations with the Confederate government.
The Confederacy might have demanded concessions that Lincoln would have found unacceptable.
The war had already exposed deep divisions within American society. Political expert. The Confederacy, for its part, would have faced its own set of internal challenges. The international community would have been forced to reassess its position on the conflict. Confederate forces would have dug in, reinvigorated by their stand against Sherman. Military analyst, the North would have found itself bogged down in a protracted and costly struggle. Public opinion would have increasingly turned against the Lincoln administration. The longer the war dragged on, the more difficult it would have become for Lincoln to maintain the Union's commitment to the fight. The South's already strained resources would have been stretched to the breaking point. Civil War historian, yet, the South's greatest asset, its unwavering belief in its cause, might have sustained it through these dark times. A prolonged war would have provided the Confederacy with more opportunities to exploit divisions within the North. Every passing month of stalemate would have strengthened the arguments of those in the North who favored a negotiated settlement.
The international implications of a prolonged civil war would have been profound.
While both nations had officially remained neutral, the possibility of recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate nation had always lingered.
British and French intervention in the American Civil War would have been a nightmare scenario for the Union.
Even without direct military intervention, British or French recognition of the Confederacy would have been a major diplomatic coup for the South. It would have signaled to the world that the United States was indeed a house divided.
In the Eastern Theater, General Robert E. Lee faced his own set of daunting challenges.
News of Wheeler's success against Sherman would have reached Lee like a breath of fresh air. The delay of Sherman's march would have offered Lee a precious commodity time.
The strategic implications of Sherman's delay would have been immediately apparent to Lee.
The pressure on Lee would have eased, allowing him to shift his focus from desperate defense to strategic counteroffensive. The possibility of breaking the siege of Richmond might have re-emerged as a viable option.
With Sherman's advance halted, Lee would have been presented with a range of strategic options, each carrying its own risks and potential rewards. He could choose to remain on the defensive, bolstering the defenses of Richmond and Petersburg, waiting for Grant to weaken himself in futile assaults against fortified positions.
Alternatively, Lee could seize the initiative, launching a surprise offensive against Grant's forces, aiming to inflict a decisive defeat that would shatter Union morale and force Grant to retreat. Such a victory, while risky, could have breathed new life into the Confederacy's hopes, particularly if it coincided with renewed Confederate offensives in the West.
Another option for Lee would have been to detach a portion of his army, sending them south to confront Sherman's forces in Georgia. This maneuver, while strategically sound, would have carried significant risks, as it would have weakened Lee's own forces defending Richmond, potentially exposing the Confederate capital to capture.
Lee, ever the astute strategist, would have weighed these options carefully, calculating the odds of success against the potential consequences of failure. The fate of the Confederacy, it seemed, hung in the balance, resting on the shoulders of its most brilliant military mind. Yet even with the respite provided by Wheeler's success against Sherman, Lee faced a sobering reality. The Confederacy was nearing the end of its tether.
The South's resources, both material and human, were dwindling at an alarming rate.
The Union blockade, while not impenetrable, had severely restricted the Confederacy's ability to import essential supplies, including weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies.
The South's industrial base, never a match for the North's, was struggling to keep pace with the demands of a protracted war.
The Confederacy's greatest asset, its manpower, was also dwindling.
The pool of eligible men willing to fight for the Southern cause was shrinking, depleted by casualties, desertions, and the growing realization that the war was lost.
The Confederacy's ability to field and supply its armies was nearing a breaking point.
Lee, a realist despite his unwavering commitment to the Southern cause, would have recognized these limitations.
He knew that time, while a valuable commodity in war, was not on his side.
The Confederacy could not hope to win a war of attrition against the industrial might and demographic superiority of the Union.
The American Civil War was not simply an internal struggle, it was a global event that captivated the attention of world leaders and ordinary citizens alike. The fate of the United States, a nation founded on principles of liberty and democracy, hung in the balance, and its outcome had the potential to reshape the geopolitical landscape.
European powers, particularly Great Britain and France, watched the conflict with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and a healthy dose of self-interest. The American experiment, with its emphasis on popular sovereignty and its rejection of hereditary monarchy, was both fascinating and unsettling to the established order.
The Confederacy, acutely aware of the potential for foreign intervention, had dispatched emissaries to European capitals, seeking diplomatic recognition and material support. These Confederate diplomats argued that the South's struggle for independence was a righteous cause, one that deserved the support of nations that valued liberty and self-determination.
The Union, for its part, had made it clear that it considered any foreign interference in the conflict to be a hostile act. The Lincoln administration, through a combination of diplomacy and veiled threats, had managed to deter European powers from openly siding with the Confederacy.
The success of Wheeler's forces against Sherman would have sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. The narrative of an inevitable Union victory, carefully cultivated by Union diplomats, would have been shattered, replaced by uncertainty and doubt.
Confederate diplomats, sensing an opportunity, would have seized upon Sherman's setback to bolster their arguments for recognition and support. They would have pointed to the resilience of the Confederate Army, the Union's apparent inability to deliver a decisive blow, and the growing war weariness in the North as evidence that the Confederacy was a viable nation deserving of international legitimacy.
Great Britain, with its economic interests in the cotton-producing South and its lingering resentment towards the United States, would have been the most likely candidate for recognizing the Confederacy. The British textile industry, heavily reliant on Southern cotton, had been hit hard by the Union blockade, and there was considerable pressure from British industrialists to break the blockade and resume trade with the South.
France, under the rule of Emperor Napoleon III, was another potential ally for the Confederacy. Napoleon III harbored ambitions of expanding French influence in the Americas, and he saw the Civil War as an opportunity to weaken the United States, a potential rival to French power.
The prospect of European intervention in the American Civil War, while always a possibility, would have become a more likely scenario with the prolongation of the conflict and the Confederacy's newfound resilience. The stakes were incredibly high, not just for the United States, but for the future of global power.
British or French recognition of the Confederacy would have been a diplomatic coup for the South and a severe blow to the Union's legitimacy. It would have signaled to the world that the United States was indeed a house divided, perhaps irrevocably so. Such recognition could have also paved the way for material support, including loans, weapons, and even military intervention.
The Union, facing the prospect of fighting a two-front war against both the Confederacy and a European power, would have been forced to divert resources and manpower from the ongoing conflict in the South. This would have stretched the Union's already strained resources to the breaking point, potentially prolonging the war for years and resulting in even greater bloodshed.
The American Civil War, already a tragedy of immense proportions, could have escalated into a global conflict with far-reaching consequences. The dream of a united nation, founded on principles of liberty and equality, would have been shattered, replaced by a fractured continent, vulnerable to foreign interference and perpetual conflict.
The hypothetical scenario of General Wheeler halting Sherman's march to the sea offers a compelling glimpse into a world of what-ifs. Yet, the Union's overwhelming industrial might and vast manpower reserves would have ultimately prevailed. Wheeler's victory would not have altered the war's ultimate outcome. The Confederacy's hopes were built on a foundation of sand. The Union's cause resonated far beyond the battlefield. The American Civil War was destined to end with the triumph of the Union. From the ashes, a stronger, more unified nation would emerge.